Basically, what I'm going to be going over today is um, uh, the four different species of hognoses, where they're found, where they live, what they eat, and then a bit of basic care information about westerns specifically. Just a disclaimer before we get started: this is not a care guide. If you actually intend to keep them and don't already, uh, probably the best bet would be to look at other care information. This is just kind of like an overview, so you can, if you're thinking about them, you can decide whether they're for you or not. But it's not the only care resource you should use, and a lot of this stuff comes down to my opinion. So don't be surprised if other people have different opinions. And then at the end, I will open up for questions in chat, and y'all can post them there throughout. I will try to read them, and then get back at the end. So, another thing, I forgot to put it in there, all of the images are royalty free, except for the ones that I took. So if I don't own the copyright to them, they're either available through Wikimedia or Reptile Database. I think some of them are Creative Commons attribution. Anybody who wants any of the information I have here, go ahead and let me know, and I can send you over whatever I have. Couple of the images are mine, but I think with that out of the way, I'll go ahead and get started. Mainly, we're going to be looking at Heterodon as pets. So I'll get into what all I mean by that in a second. But what we're not going to cover a lot of is other genera, and also a lot of like individual population natural behaviors. This presentation is not going to take too long, and I don't want to get too in the weeds. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So when we say hognose, we could mean a lot of different things. Generally, what it refers to is an adaptation that certain snakes have developed convergently to have an upturned rostral scale. That's the scale right at the front of the nose if you're looking at them face on. With regards to what it's for, usually it's an adaptation that they've evolved to help push up loose substrate. Different species that have this adaptation have it to different degrees, and that's one of the things that you'll one of the things you'll see when you're going to try to identify different species is the amount of turn of that rostral scale. But not all hognose snakes are even in the same family. Not all of them are even colubrids. So when I say hognose, I'm going to be a bit more specific. Basically, what I mean by that is there are three different genera that are called hognoses. The first one is that you'll have probably heard of as Heterodon. That's the Western hognose, or not Western hognose, the North American hognoses, Heterodon. There's Xenodon, which is the South American hognoses. They were formerly all kind of clumped together in Lystrophis. And then there's Leoheterodon, which is the Madagascar giant hognoses. Xenodon and Heterodon are actually both colubrids. They're not too distantly related. Leoheterodon is not in the same family at all. It's not a colubrid. It's in the family I'm not going to say that. I'm not saying it. You can read it. For what we're talking about, we're not talking about anything other than heterodon. We're not going to be discussing Madagascars because I'm not familiar with them, or the tricolors, which is the xenodons, formerly Lystrophis. Their care is quite variable. So if you are interested in tricolors or Leoheterodons, their care is going to be quite a bit different from Heterodon, and their enclosures, their lifespans, for instance, tricolors only live about 8 years from what I've gathered. Now, whether that comes down to husbandry and we just haven't figured out how to get them to live longer in captivity, or if it's just a natural lifespan thing, I don't know if anyone's sure on that, but from everything I've seen, and the main reason I don't have much interest in keeping tricolors is because they don't live that long. And then Leoheterodon is quite a bit different. They are still rear fang venomous, like Xenodon and Heterodon, but they have a different type of venom, and they have a different type of rear fang that places them more closely related to elapids than it does to colubrids. Moving right along. So there are some quick facts about Heterodon. There are 4 currently recognized species. All of them are native to North America. And then every one of the 4 species can be found in the United States. There is an additional species found in Mexico, and then easterns and westerns have both been found in parts of Canada, with the range of westerns running a little bit further north. So when you're looking at the map in a minute, you'll see that the easterns are concentrated, at least in Canada, they're concentrated around the Great Lakes, so they don't go quite as far north. They're sexually dimorphic. Females are quite a bit larger than males as adults. Now, I wouldn't use this as a diagnostic feature when you're going to like say you pick one up in the wild, unless it's 3 feet long and 500 grams. That's definitely a female. But if you're just looking at a not quite fully grown snake in the wild, it's going to be hard to tell. And like I said, unless you get a really giant female, because you could, the best bet's to look at count the tail scales, which I'll try to get into in a minute. They're diurnal, which means they're active mostly during the day. They're well known for some defensive behaviors. We'll get into that because that's shared between all 4 species. They have a shovel-shaped rostral scale that gives them their common name, and the 2 most common species to keep as pets are H. nasicis and H. platyrhynus. That would be the western and eastern hognoses, respectively. So let's really quickly go over each of the 4 species, and then we'll talk more about westerns. So let me click through all this. So there are 4 species. There's westerns, easterns, Mexicans, and southerns. There was formerly a 5th species called Gloides, which was the dusty hognose snake. They have been lumped into western hognoses. So there's currently H. nasicis, H. platyrhynus, H. kinnerlii, and H. simus. Of those, the one with the smallest range overall is likely to be the southern. The Mexican has the smallest range in the United States, but its range is pretty far into Mexico, so you can find them in a pretty wide area inside Mexico, and they're pretty common And I have borrowed some screenshots out of my Peterson's field guide here that just kind of goes over their range. I changed that because this particular field guide still references Gloidy as a separate species, but you can see right here on the west side of their range, you've got Mexicans that go way down into Mexico, Westerns that go basically right from the edge of the Mexican range. So some people would say the Westerns and the Mexicans are actually one species. That is a thing. For the purposes of this presentation, I've demarked them as two separate species. I think they're different enough. But if you do describe, if they are two separate species, there is a small hybrid zone right here in the middle where you will find hybrids. It does happen. And then over on the east, you'll see that we have Gloidy, which are actually just pockets of Westerns further east than they should be. So they're more closely related to Westerns than they are to Easterns. And we'll get into the Easterns and Southerns in a second, which are more closely related to each other. Southerns are quite striking. If there was one that we could start keeping as pets, then it would definitely be Southerns as a more common pet in the hobby. But they're obligate toad eaters. Not obligate, but they're a lot harder to get on the rodents than Nassicas. So then we have the eastern half of the United States. Platyrhynus, you'll notice, has a massive range, including where I live in south central Texas. And then you also have the Southerns. Now, I'm not sure that this is actually describing the entire range. This is out of the Peterson Field Guide. That said, it could, I've seen in other field guides that this goes a little bit further south into Florida, that this covers a little bit more of Georgia and Alabama and stuff like that, where it's like going further up, or not Georgia, going further up towards up north into the Carolinas, and then covering more through the northern parts of these states. So you'll end up with, and even I've heard that they might be in, somewhat findable in Louisiana. I mean, they're not recognizing state borders, so I wouldn't be surprised if you found them in the eastern parts of Louisiana. Either way, southern hognose Heterodon seamus is found. A lot of protections are for them in Florida. We'll get into that in a minute because there are a couple of different localities, and their localities look very different. So we're going to look at the southern hognose. This is, like I said earlier, these are royalty-free images. This is a picture of a Florida red. So they don't all look like this. This is a Florida-specific locality. But they have a very sharply upturned rostral scale, like much more than their eastern cousins. They're the shortest of all heterodons. The longest one ever found was 24 inches. So that's a whole foot short of a good-sized Western female, and Easterns tend to get even bigger. Their bellies and tails are similarly colored. This is a diagnostic feature when you're checking to see if you've got an Eastern or a Southern. We'll get into that, but Easterns, their tails tend to be differently colored from their bellies. Now, this isn't always true. My local variant, there is a slight difference in the color, but you have to really look for it on the Easterns, whereas there's some Easterns where the tail and the belly have like a clear defining line. But again, we'll get into that. They range from like a light brown to like a cream, all the way to this like gorgeous crimson red. And then they tend to have dark brown or black spots. And they are as ever, dimorphic, sexually dimorphic, with females larger than males, and their clutch sizes, which I didn't put into the presentation, but I'll just say, are a little bit smaller than easterns. So when they do have babies, they don't have quite as many. And this is going to be coming up a lot, areas with sandy soils. They live in groves, fields, sandy woods. They can live in converted farmland, which you would think would make them quite adaptable. And for the most part, it does with other species. With these guys, they are vulnerable. We'll get into that in a minute. But they can live basically anywhere with a loose, upturned soil and a good amount of moisture. And we'll get into what they eat here in a second. So they eat toads, frogs, and occasionally some rodents. Depending on the population pocket, they will eat different things at different times of the year. So there's some easterns that will eat toads at one point in the year when they are able to get toads, and they'll eat lizards and other amphibians at other parts of the year when they're not. Similarly, southerns will exhibit some of the same behavior where their diet changes slightly throughout the year, but it's worth noting that with both southerns and easterns, that something like 90% of their diet or more is amphibians. They're listed as vulnerable by the IUCN, and one thing is that the Florida red population seems to be at particular risk compared to other localities. I wasn't able to entirely confirm numbers, but it seems like the Florida reds are probably the least common of the localities. And you'll notice that every single one of these snakes looks very different. Keeping them as pets. They're not very commonly kept as pets at all. Definitely not as much as westerns or easterns. Due to their really amphibian-centric diet, it can be very hard to get them on Rosenthal rodents, especially because there aren't a lot of captive bred ones. It's apparently easier than eastern hognoses, which have been noted to be near impossible to get to fully switched Rosenthal rodents if they're from the wild, and even switching babies might require lifelong scenting. They're not often available on places like Morph Market. They are being bred, but you're going to have to go and find a breeder on Facebook Marketplace or something if you want one. So if you do want an southern, then you're going to have to look for it, and it might not be legal where you are because, like I said, they are protected in certain states. Next, we'll look at the Mexican hognose snake. That's Heterodon kennerlii. And moving right into it, you'll notice they look a lot like westerns if you've ever seen a western. They max out at about 30 inches, which makes them a little bit shorter than your westerns. This could be selection bias. They're generally pretty close in size, but it does appear the westerns, on average, are a little bit bigger. They're brown to tan in appearance, and they usually have a black pigment on their belly and a sharply upturned rostral scale. Basically, everything I just said can apply to westerns. So just keep that in mind. These aren't really diagnostic features for them, at least. They live in dry prairies, semi-arid habitats with sandy soils, areas with sandy soils, semi-deserts. So they're definitely a more arid species, or depending on who you are, subspecies. looking at their diet and conservation, they eat lizards, amphibians, and rodents. Um, they're currently listed as secure. Actually, they're not listed at all by the IUCN, so you have to go by nature serves, which I misspelled in there. Oops. But they're G4 apparently secure, so they're a solid population. They're not really commonly kept as pets, but if you get a hold of one, it's going to be a lot like a Western. They're easier to get onto rodents, and you can, generally speaking, find some sort of a breeder. Um, so if you're interested in a Mexican, they're a little bit more common. One of the problems with buying a Mexican is that A, it could have Western bred into it somewhere, or B, you could be getting an actual Mexican sold. This used to happen a lot more back before hognoses were quite popular as pets. Was you would get a Mexican sold to you as a Western, because the way it used to be divided were Westerns included everything that wasn't an Eastern or a Southern, and that included Dusties. And if you were referring specifically to H. nasicus, you were referring to Plains hognoses. Now Western refers to Plains hognoses, Heterodon nasicus, and Mexicans are still widely considered to be a separate species. But if you go out and specifically look for one, you'll find one. Let's next look at Platyrhynus, which is the eastern hognose and my favorite scientific name to say. This is a horrible picture to demonstrate this, but their rostral scale is less sharply upturned than are the other species. It's still upturned, but it's not quite as aggressively upturned. And that's incorrect. They're the longest of the heterodon snakes. I just need to edit that slide. They max out at about 50 inches. Their tail is usually a brighter color than their belly, but this isn't always true. They're very highly variable in color, both on the belly and the dorsal scales range vastly in color depending on where you get it. The ones out here in my area that I found are going to look nothing like the ones where you are. Super highly variable, but you will tend to notice that they have browns or reddish colors, and then they can have yellow, black, or gray spots. This is a particularly interesting specimen from Wikipedia. You'll see the one that I have a personal picture of that looks a lot more typical in a moment. And of course, they're sexually dimorphic. Females are quite a bit larger than males. You'll also notice that they have quite an ability to hood up when they're stressed compared to other hognoses. You're really not going to mistake an Eastern for a Western. Easterns are much more dramatic, and they can hood up a lot more, and yeah, they just totally different personalities. They can live in woodlands, fields, river valleys, and any area with sandy soil. They don't even necessarily need to live in sandy soil. They live out here in clay. They eat toads, frogs, other amphibians. They may consume rodents in the wild. It's not been recorded. They probably do eat some lizards. The IUCN lists them as least concern. Here's the one that I caught, by the way. If you were wondering which one it was. So you'll notice this is a very, very, very different pattern than the other ones. Easterns are less common than Westerns in captivity, but they are a lot more common than Southerns, and probably more common than Mexicans at this point. Mexicans used to be more common than they are now. Their diet in the wild is almost exclusively toads and other amphibians, like something like 97%. I've read from one study it can be very difficult to get them eating rodents in captivity, and that's why not many people keep them. They're a bit more challenging to acquire than a western hognose, but still quite a bit more attainable than other species. And there are people breeding them, quite a few, but you typically won't see them on Morph Market very much. Certainly not like you will westerns. So you may have to go out and actually contact a breeder and figure out when they are going to have when they're going to have captive bred babies available. And now we're going to look at, before we take a look at westerns, we're going to take a look at some similarities and differences between the different species. They all share this defensive behavior. This is what happened within 30 seconds of the one that I found out here the other day, realizing that I wasn't going to leave. Except you don't get to see the other part where it's writhing around on the ground and being a complete drama queen and tried to, poop on me and just made the... If you've ever encountered just a little anecdote, if you've ever encountered an eastern in the wild and pissed it off enough at you to pull this stunt, they sound like a grown adult man when they're emptying their bowels. They are just incredibly good at grossing you out. You don't want to touch them. And that's probably what they're doing. They're not really playing dead. They're just being like, look, I'm disgusting. You don't want to eat me. Or touch me or whatever. And, I kind of buy it. That was like the first time I heard that, I was like, wow, that was loud. Man, it doesn't smell great either. So the first thing they'll do is they'll hiss. They can hiss very loud for a snake their size, like incredibly loud. They can puff up their like hood up like a cobra, especially the easterns can hood up real big. They might mock strike at you, where basically they just leave their mouth closed and they peck you with their upturned rostral scale. And instead of biting you, they just peck at you. And generally they won't bite. Generally they go straight on to rolling over, writhing around on the ground, excreting all their waste. And especially in the case of southerns, they'll sometimes pop a blood vessel in their mouth and bleed out of their mouth while they're doing this whole stunt. Easterns tend to be a lot more dramatic. They tend to writhe around a lot more. They tend to make a big stink compared to the westerns, who will play dead, but they don't generally do the whole, I flipped you back over, now I must go back onto my back thing that the easterns do. I'm sure you've all seen it on YouTube. So, moving right along. Just some identifying characteristics. Again, this is out of the Peterson's Field Guide. You'll notice that the rostral scale shape is going to be a little bit shallower in easterns. It's going to be a little bit steeper in southerns, and then it's going to be really steep in all the other species or subspecies. Now, that to me, between that and the hooding up and the hood shape, is probably the most diagnostic feature. But most easterns will have a dark belly and a light tail. You'll notice the one that I just had a picture of up playing dead did not. It was its tail, and actually, let me go back to it. That tail and body are almost exactly the same color. The tail might be a little bit lighter, but they're almost exactly the same color. So I don't love this as a diagnostic feature, but this was out of the Field Guide. Typically, their belly will be a different color than their tail. In southerns, you'll see the coloration is quite a bit more similar. And then in all the rest of them, you'll see masses of black pigment with, the little yellow spots down the belly. Probably the easiest way to tell what hognose you have, if you're holding one in your hand out in the wild, is where you are. The easterns and westerns are easy to tell apart, and their habitats don't really overlap at all. If you're trying to get down to whether or not you have a dusty, again, location, because they don't really overlap with the westerns, there's an intermediary zone where you might have a Mexican or you might have a western. Those are really hard to tell apart. Functionally, you don't even really need to know which you have, and then if you get deep enough into either habitat, it's easy. The ones that you might actually need to try to tell apart in the wild are in the south, where you have eastern and southern overlap. And the easiest way to tell that is going to be the rostral scale, the degree to which it's upturned. Southerns are pretty dramatic, so you can't really tell as much by that. So probably the easiest way is the rostral scale, the coloration. And then if you really get down to it, if you know for a fact you're looking at an adult, then if it's a small adult, then it could be a southern. But I don't usually use body size as an identifying characteristic, because it could just be a really small eastern, or a male of one, versus a female of the other. Like the biggest female southerns are about the same size as the biggest male easterns. Some other similarities between them. They're all at least semi-fossorial, so they will dig. They dig in soil and sand and burrow. Now, that doesn't mean they don't climb. Pretty common misconception. Hognoses will climb in both captivity and the wild. And they're quite capable of doing so to some extent. They're not going to go up a, 40-foot tree, but they might end up quite a bit above ground level, depending on where they are and what time of year it is and what they're doing. They all share the same defensive characteristics, though the degree to which they express them varies. Every single hognose is going to try to eat amphibians if it can help it. Every single one. They might eat other things sometimes, but all 4 species in the wild, they're going to eat amphibians. Other similarities are they're all diurnal, they all have keeled scales, and they all lay, their eggs all hatch after about 60 days of laying the clutch. Breeding season, and this is part of the reason that you don't end up with more hybrids in the wild, is their breeding seasons are staggered. So westerns are breeding in an earlier part of spring in most places than easterns are. Mexicans are breeding in a different part. You can look that up on breeding seasons if you're so inclined, but their natural breeding seasons are staggered from each other. So, that's one of the other reasons that people think Mexicans might be a different species, beyond some scalation things and some slight anatomical differences. February to March for plains, depending on where you are. If you're further up north, it might be a little later in the year. And then the easterns, I think, are typically like March to May, and then the southerns are actually a little later in the year. And the Mexicans are, I don't know. I'm not going to pretend to know all the different breeding seasons for all the different localities, but yeah, their breeding seasons are staggered. That's part of the reason that they will, you won't see quite as many hybrids, like especially between southerns and easterns. Their breeding seasons don't overlap very much, if at all. So let's finally get to probably the star of the show, the one I've been showing you a picture of the whole time, Heterodon nasicus, the westerns. I I could have used nothing but my own pictures, but I wanted to use some pictures that were not mine because he is a morph, and he's just one example, so I did mix in some pictures of not him. Maximum length is about 36 inches. You'll sometimes see him up to about 40, I think. I'm not quite sure I remember the record, but the maximum length is not quite as big as a big Eastern. I'm sorry, Elizabeth. I should have gotten pictures of Lilith. They tend to be tan or gray or brown with darker blotches. They have a black pigment on their belly with white or yellow blotches, and they have a very sharply upturned rostral scale compared to every other species of heterodon. And you can see that right here in PA's rostral scale. It's kind of hard because of the angle, but you can kind of see that. They live in prairies, river floodplains, scrublands, grasslands, even in semi-deserts, and basically anywhere in their range that has a sandy or loose soil. That's the common thread here. They all very much enjoy living in areas where they can bury themselves, and that means loose or sandy soils. So if you're in an area that has a loose soil and you're in the hognose range, there's a good chance that hognoses live near you. And in fact, even if you don't, I have hognoses that live in my backyard, and my soil is super far from sandy or appropriate based on this description. So even if not, I mean, they're very, very common snakes, but because they're fossorial, you don't see them as much. Just laying out on, a patch of grass. Get lucky sometimes and see them. Follow the frogs and toads if you want to catch a hognose. The frogs and toads are out, then they're more than likely going to be out too. And they still eat amphibians, lizards, and occasionally in the wild, rodents. This is all wild eating habits. So they will eat rodents in the wild. It's been documented. It's not common, but it does happen. They're listed as least concerned by the IUCN, and that's secure if you go with NatureServe. And the only one that wasn't listed by the IUCN was Mexican, so I went with the IUCN's rating system. Anyway, they're the most commonly kept as pets. As far as hognoses in the reptile trade, they are more common than, tricolors or Leoheterodon. I would say if you counted Leoheterodon as a hognose, then they're probably the second most common, even over Easterns, because people like big snakes. But yeah, Westerns are by far the most commonly kept. They're naturally toad eaters, but they're much easier to switch to rodents than Easterns or even Southerns, depending on who you talk to. And you could go on Morph Market and have one shipped out to you tomorrow. I'm going to go over a little bit of keeping information. Now, again, just a disclaimer, I am not providing you a care guide right now. This should have most of the information you need, but I would highly recommend, if you intend to get a hognose, verify it and make sure that this is actually the type of care you want to be providing. Males and females are very different sizes as adults. So the minimum enclosure size is going to depend on whether you have a male or female. You can get away with a 20-gallon for life for a relatively small male. 30-gallon would be better. I wouldn't go below a 40 on a female. On a female, you're probably going to want to go 40 plus. And then if you're using a tub system, now I hate doing quarts for these Sterilite tubs, but like a 28 to 32 quart tub looks like it's about the right size for at least a male, probably a female as well. It's just because those 32 quart tubs have a lot of ground space. That said, if you're just keeping a pet snake, I wouldn't go with the tub. You don't get to see him as much, and it's just not quite as cool for the snake. You don't get to put in as many climbing opportunities. It's just a little bit suboptimal. If you're breeding them, then I totally get it. But if you're or as a quarantine setup, but if you're just keeping a display pet or a pet that you can handle, I would go with probably just a glass terrarium. You can pick up a 20-gallon at Walmart for like $20. So, I mean, honestly, it's not even that much more expensive than going with a tub. Some other things you'll need, and this is pretty much every snake, but you'll need thermostat, electronic timer, thermometer, hygrometer, substrate hides, sphagnum moss, a water dish, decorations, and enrichment, a heat source, a spray bottle, and a humid hide. And that's probably the one that you don't need with every snake, but I would recommend, unless you have a hognose that is spending too much time in their humid hide and you have to take it away when they're not in shed because they're going to get themselves scale rot. I would say every hognose should have a humid hide. That kind of represents their natural ability to regulate their humidity in the wild, where they can burrow deeper to get to more moist soil and regulate that level of humidity. So you can definitely try offering a humid hide. I use sphagnum moss. There are other materials you could use. And then we'll go into substrates in a moment. I tend to go with, so when you're quarantining them, even though they are burrowing species, I would still go paper towels or newspaper, but just go with paper towels. They're not expensive, and that's probably the best thing to quarantine them on. But once you move them off of paper towels, you can set them up with a lot of different substrates. I like aspen because it holds a good burrow, and it's inexpensive and it's relatively dry. You can do play sand soil mix, especially if you're going bioactive. You can go Reptichips. I wouldn't go with cocoa bark or anything like that, cocoa blocks, because A, it's probably not going to hold a burrow very well, and B, it's probably going to get too humid. Definitely, if I was going to go with anything other than aspen, I would probably go with just a play sand soil mix, favoring the play sand, and make sure it's nice and loose. But still clumps together enough to hold a burrow, and you can test that. It's kind of like a clump test. If you clump it in your hand and you see if it holds together at all, then it'll hold a burrow. But otherwise, aspen does work quite well for hognoses. I don't see any problem with it. If you're doing aspen, I would go with about 4 to 8 inches of depth on that, if possible. Usually the lip of your enclosure for the front opening is going to limit how deep you can go with the substrate. If you're doing something like aspen, because it's so loose and it compacts down, I would go with as much as you possibly can. In fact, to the point where I use a top opening enclosure because I can go with nearly 8 inches of substrate. Play sand soil mix, at least 4 inches still. I would probably go a little bit deeper, but you could probably get away with 4 inches. Buried inside the substrate, you can put in paper towel rolls or other sorts of rings and stuff for them to crawl through, buried down in the substrate. But I would be careful of what I put on top of the substrate. If they burrow under something quite heavy, they could get pinned or crushed. So be careful what you lay directly on top of the substrate, especially if it's something a little bit more fluffy like aspen. What I do in my enclosure is I have a shelf on the back where I have a couple of rocks and like his water dish and that sort of thing, that's not covered in substrate, so I don't have to put heavy stuff right on top of where he's going to be burrowing under. Because I found him under the water dish several times, burrowed under there, and I would rather not risk a burrow collapsing and having a rock pin him to the bottom or anything like that. So that's just something to consider, is what you put on top of the substrate, because they do burrow. UVB, you don't have to use it. I like it. There's been some evidence that it helps with egg calcification and stuff like that. Is your snake not going to live a full and happy life if you don't give them UVB? Nah, it's fine. You don't need it, but you can if you want. They're buried so much they're not exposed to it a lot, but it might have some health benefits. So I choose to offer it whether you do or not. It's kind of a personal choice. So some considerations on lighting. Lighting can be a heat source, or it can just be ambient light. You don't have to heat from the top. In fact, I don't, just because it's a small enclosure and he's burrowed most of the time anyway. I heat from the bottom. It's glass, so it conducts well, and so I heat from the bottom on Hiei's enclosure. You can do overhead lighting, but the light should be either on a timer or a dimmer. It should be a natural-ish white light. You don't want red lights or purple lights or whatever. If you're gonna do overhead heat, I would say probably go with a CHE, so you can have a little bit on at night, and just have it on an on-off thermostat, which is cheaper anyway than using a dimmer. Then you don't have to worry about having, a light that's both acting as the heat source and the light source. I would probably just go with some, LEDs or some, not heat bulb for the daylight light source. But they do need UVA, and they do need daylight, and they need a good daylight cycle because they are diurnal. They're going to be pretty much not doing a whole lot at night, so you don't really, even if I was keeping one in a tub, I wouldn't be keeping it in total darkness. They need the UVA, and they need kind of that day-night cycle to regulate, including knowing what season it is, because they will attempt to brumate if the day lengths get too short. You will probably, the day-night cycle is important to their regulation of their annual cycle, where they go, breeding season and brumation and all of that. So one of the things I will say is, if your hognose stops eating out of the blue, could be lighting. I mean, if it thinks it's winter, then they do stop eating throughout the early, through certain months of the year, because that's when they want to brumate. So lighting is definitely a consideration, and probably, just something to keep in mind is that they do need a consistent day-night cycle, and that way they can kind of get what they're getting in the wild. But as far as heat sources go, it's going to depend on your enclosure type. If you have PVC, then you probably need to go with the heat bulb, CHE, or heat panel. For tubs, you pretty much have to go under tank, but if you're going glass enclosure, you can go either way. I personally go with under tank heating, like I said. And as far as light, I don't want a heat emitting light source. I just like to kind of keep those two functions separated. Where you have light and you have heat, and you don't have to worry about trying to correctly give them enough of both, from the same thing. It lets you kind of tweak things a little bit more. So I like, just CHEs and LEDs if I'm going to do over tank, and heat pads and LEDs or whatever if I'm going under the tank. As far as decorations go, you can get pretty creative. I'm like super cheap and quite lazy with it, so I'll do rocks and branches and fake plants. You can do paper towel rolls, toilet paper rolls, anything that's easy enough to spot clean or replace periodically. You can go with that's safe for the animal. I have like a die cast Mazda Miata in Hiei's cage, like just some enrichment. He's got his own very own little car. He's got his petrified wood. You can do flowers, vines, whatever. Something they do need some sort of rough surface for shedding. So I would definitely, whether it be like he usually sheds right inside his humid hide, and so he just scrapes his body along the edge, and I find the shed right there on top of it. But they might want to rub up against a rock or whatever. So having some sort of rough surface in there, some cover, just things like that, good idea. They in the wild will use natural burrows in addition to creating their own. So that's kind of what the toilet paper rolls simulate when you stick them down in there. But it's totally optional. It's whatever you want to set up for your snake, as long as it's not gonna poke or poison them, then they're fine. I think 3 hides is the setup that most folks should go with, unless you're able to do a bioactive setup in a big enclosure with a humidity gradient. But I like humid hides for them. You can DIY them. You can make them out of Tupperware or whatever. But I would go 3 hides. 2 regular hides, one on the cool side, one on the warm side, and then a humid hide. And just a quick rundown of some temperature considerations. You can go as high as even over 92F on the hot spot during the daytime, but the warm side ambient I like to keep a little below 90, like 85, 86. I still like to keep the warm side at about 80 degrees, 82, 83 at night. And then the cool side, I try to keep right at 75 pretty much all the time. So they're not too complicated or different from other North American colubrids. Just mind that they're not cooking or freezing, and you should be fine. They need a nice warm spot. But, I've found from a lot of hognoses that, yes, they will occasionally use the hot side of their cage, but generally they're going to be chilling kind of somewhere in the middle. And then ambient humidity, I would stay under 50%. 35 to 40% is really good. And then a humid hide, it could, humid hide could almost be 100%, but I would make sure that it's not dripping wet. So like an 80% humidity humid hide would be perfect, just for really shedding and kind of regulating. You're gonna want to try to get your hognose rodent feeders. When you buy your hognose, they should already be on rodent feeders. If they're not, then there was an issue with the breeder. If the breeder should be telling you if they're not on rodents yet. But most of the time you're going to buy one from a breeder, they're going to be on rodents. They're going to want a meal about the size of their girthiest spot. You've all heard it before. That, you want to find the girthiest spot of the snake, and that's the size feeder. They may go off. They generally eat really well, but they may go off feed for a certain period of the year, because in the wild they will go off feed during the winter months when they brumate. So don't be surprised if they go off feed periodically. They are, as far as colubrids go, they're not the most fast metabolism to colubrids. They're not going to starve more than likely, especially if they're at a healthy weight when they go off feed. Just when they get back on to feed, put them back on, feed them, they should put weight back on. He went off food, and I think he lost 3 grams when he went off food, is all. He did lose a little bit of weight, but not a whole lot. It was very minor, and he went off food for over a month and a half. So I would not worry too much about the going off feed. The worst part about it is if you don't have another snake, you're basically throwing rodents away, trying to figure out if they're going to eat this time. So I guess the point is get 2 snakes so you have something to do with the like hoppers they don't eat, or the fuzzies they don't eat, or the mice they don't eat. Just get a garbage disposal. You'll be fine. And information, totally unnecessary unless you plan on breeding them. It can be dangerous to the snake, and I really don't recommend it to anyone who doesn't know what they're doing. If you're breeding them, then you pretty much have to brumate. They probably will not breed unless you brumate, or they're way less likely to breed unless you brumate. Basically you're just going to find a target temp and kind of slowly lower it down. So like the first thing people do is they'll turn off the enclosure heat and get them down to room temperature, and then they'll slowly drop their temperature until they're in that like 50-degree range. Still not ideal. Snakes die in brumation all the time. So if you don't actually have to do it, probably shouldn't. As far as enclosures, I wouldn't go with the tub unless I had to. PVC can be okay. If you aren't breeding, you're going to be able to see them a lot better in PVC or glass. But I think glass aquariums for hognoses are just fine. They don't need the humidity retention you get with like a PVC enclosure or anything. So they should be just fine in an ordinary glass aquarium style enclosure. Other considerations: if your snake is spending way too much time in the humid hide, you can consider removing it when the snake is in thin shed. Use purified water or conditioned tap water to put in their water bowls. Technically speaking, tap water should be fine. The chlorine levels are at low enough concentrations that it shouldn't hurt them. But I like to make sure that the water I'm giving is dechlorinated before I give it. They will potentially overeat. I've seen a lot of fat hognoses lately. Now, some females are going to look fat, but generally speaking, they will overeat. If you give them, they will eat as much food as you give them, and they don't need to eat as often as other colubrids. They can eat, like when they're younger, they'll eat every 7 days or so. By the time they're adults, you can probably space it out to quite near 2 weeks. They're not going to go as long as boas or ball pythons without food, but you can give it a pretty good spacing between meals once they're fully grown, especially on a really big female that you're not planning on breeding. They don't need to eat that often. You want to make sure they're out and not burrowed when you try to feed them, because they're probably not going to notice you holding a mouse and a pair of tongs if they're burrowed under the substrate. So try to get it. They'll eat pretty much any time of day, but they're out generally during the daytime, so they eat better during the daytime because they're easier to find. They're generally fossorial, but they'll climb if given the chance. every Hognose I've seen climbs a little bit, if they're given the chance. Mine does it. Friends do it. Everyone that I've seen, if they have a branch, they'll climb it. So I like to say, if you have the space in your enclosure, give them a branch or two. You'll probably see them more often because they like to climb. And now I will open for questions. I don't think I saw any, but if anybody has any questions, I can open the floor.